All right, it's 11:02, so we're going to go ahead and dive in. Thank you for joining us today. Today's webinar topic will be maximize your patient database. So before we dive into all of the overview and agenda for today, I thought I would give a quick intro for myself and let my co-host introduce himself as well. So my name is Joey Wickham. I am an account manager here at Vital Interaction. Been working here almost 4 years at this point. So Chris and I have worked on a lot of projects together, but specifically, we have worked with customers over a wide variety of specialties, literally hundreds of customers, working on various projects to increase patient engagement and, in light of today's topic, how to maximize the patient database that they already have, working with a lot of our current customers. So that being said, I love some of the data that we've been able to pull recently that we'll be putting into this presentation. So for your practice, hopefully it'll give you some ideas of how you can really maximize that as well on your side. So that's a brief intro for myself. Chris, I'll let you go ahead and then I'll go over our agenda.
Yeah, I'm Chris. I've been at VI for coming up to 7 years now, believe it or not. I can't believe it's been 4 years for you, Joey. That's amazing. Feels like yesterday when you joined. It's mad.
Time flies.
Yeah, so I started at VI working on support and then doing various wearing many different hats, but now my main role is product manager, and I work closely with Joey, trying to sort of bridge the gap between customer requests and then helping the product side to sort of make that happen and obviously improve our features. So yeah, I'm excited for today. I think we've come a long way in our maximizing our patient database and the things that you can do with that.
Yeah. I think that just taking a brief step back, I think that's in the history of Vital Interaction, what's oftentimes separated us is the ability to look at data sets and make heads and tails of the data that's there. And honestly, Chris is a lot of the brains behind that. And I've been privileged to work with him. And we work with a lot of customers around that. So I'm excited to present today on some of what we've learned. And again, hopefully it'll be helpful for you in your practices as you run them and seek to help patients, which is all of our goal. So our agenda, you'll see there on the left side. So we're going to take you through four different steps here. First one, defining your target audience, figuring out who are you even trying to reach out to. We're talking about maximizing your patient database. Who are those patients? What are you trying to maximize within them? Then separating from that into, okay, what kind of campaigns are you wanting to send to them? What kind of communication do you want to be reaching out? In what context do you want to be doing that? The third piece being the messaging, the verbiage behind how you're reaching out to them. We've learned a lot in our years of experimentation, even based off of regions of the US, how people respond better. And then the fourth piece and final piece, which is probably like one of the most important pieces of this, is tracking and measuring those results. It's one thing to just, try something, but it's another thing to try it and then measure the results and change based off of the results that you learn. So that's going to be our agenda today. And what I would mention is if you have questions as we do go through the presentation, please feel free to insert those into the Q&A section. So at the bottom of your screen, there should be a little Q&A, little chat boxes. You can click that and add questions as we go. And those will just come to us initially, so you don't have to worry about that going out to the entire world. Those will come to us, and if they're relevant, then we'll either answer them directly or we'll answer them at the end when we do our Q&A session. We'll have a brief Q&A session at the end for that as well. Or if there's just like things that you want to talk about as we're going through it or notes that you have, you can put those in the chat as well. And I may even have like a couple of questions as we go for you to be thinking about. That I think will help to make this more valuable for you. That way you can be thinking about how this not only just applies in a large spectrum, but also to your practice specifically. So please feel free to use those tools as we go through this presentation. We want this to be as valuable as possible for you. So with that, we'll dive in. All right, so defining your target audience. So what we mean by this is basically defining who are your patients. There's multiple different specialties that are represented that are probably watching this webinar right now. But thinking through who are the patients that that you're currently trying to reach out to. What are the methods that you're using to reach out to those patients? There's when I think about it, there's the aspect of acquiring new patients, like marketing pieces to those patients, trying to make sure that you're or to maybe you should say prospects, so people who aren't patients yet, trying to get them into your office. But specifically what we're focusing on is people who have at one point or another been into your practice. That's what I think of as your patient database. And then narrowing that down and saying, who are my subsets within those patients, and what are my outreaches to those patients? So if we go to the next slide here, basically what I'm thinking through, and this is just going to be two very simple examples, and I'll hand it over to Chris, who may have some other like more in-depth examples. But thinking through the ideas of, these are two examples: patients with a future appointment who haven't been seen in a year. Those are some patients that you may want to reach out to. The other one is, hey, maybe you do some sort of a trunk show or open house or something like that at your practice, and patients have indicated interest in that in the past. So that might be your other subset. So that's what I mean when I say, like, really thinking through and defining who your target audience is. It's saying, hey, who are my patients that I've had before? What might be their interest specifically? And then how can I cater to them? And I think it's important to take a step back and think through, what are you already doing around that? Do you do any mailers out to all of your patients? Do you currently send any like campaign emails out to them? Because that's going to help you think through, hey, what is the time that I'm already spending on this, or the time that I wish I could spend on this? And what might be the value of reaching out to those target audiences? So Chris, I'll hand it over to you. I mean, I know that you've worked with a lot of practices around like segregating the data into different subsets of patients, but I thought I'd give you a chance to give some examples of how you might have seen that.
Yeah, so if we take the broad example, patients without a future appointment or haven't been seen in a year, if you think about different practices such as eye care, it's important to get your eyes checked every year. Mm-hmm. And even if you look on a deeper level to look at diagnosis codes or CPT codes, so patients might have a certain diagnosis, and it could be a serious diagnosis. How do you know if those patients are being seen by a doctor, for example? So one example might be a patient might be diagnosed with sort of cataracts, for example. Are they eligible for surgery? And how do you track those as well? How do you, is it manual phone calls? Do you have to call those patients? Is there some sort of list in the PM system that you have to manage and control? And I think the one thing that we specialize in is triangulating that data and look at, okay, let's look at all patients without an eye exam in 1 year and subtract those patients, which we'll get into in the later slides. And then let's send them a message to say, hey, we've noticed you haven't been seen in a year, or maybe it's every 3 months for therapy treatment, for example. So if you can think about all the patients that have appointments in your system, that's a great thing, and we can remind patients of their appointment. But what about patients that do not have an appointment, that really do need care? Mm-hmm. And I think that's what's becoming super important, especially with care coordination and certain MIPS and macro measures that practices are having to measure, is let's make sure that we follow up with patients that really, really need help, basically. Yeah. And we always say this in many webinars, Joey, but there's one thing to automate a lot of this process, but it also isn't going to it kind of coincides with the manual process as well, because there is a human touch of calling patients. So automation isn't the answer to everything, but I think it's good to be aware of that there is that possibility to target any patient with any appointment, diagnosis, or CPT code build, and let's target certain patients to get them back into the office. So by patients without a future appointment in 1 year, that's what we mean by care coordination. How often should a patient be seen? Let's track patients that haven't had an appointment or missed an appointment or canceled an appointment. Let's try and make an effort to reach out to those patients with some sort of automated fashion with the reporting that goes in hand. And then you have patients indicated in a trunk show, for example. So, and we'll get into these tools as well, but maybe there's marketing initiatives that practices need to make. Maybe there's a new provider arriving, or maybe an address change at a location, things like that, to where you can just upload all of a list of your patients or a predetermined list of patients and just send them out a bulk message to sort of keep them engaged. And I think, again, and we'll talk about this, it's one thing to keep patients engaged, and then there's another thing to over remind patients as well. So I think there's that fine balance that we tend to work with a lot of our customers on.
Yeah, and I think you're exactly right. I think it's that like the automation versus like personal outreach is really key with a lot of the practices that we work with, is figuring out what is the balance. And I think what's important to realize is the automation isn't replacing the human interaction, but it's figuring out what can you replace in terms of what you're having to put manual effort into with automation to help make sure that the patient, like when they're actually visiting the office, they get the care that they need. But so as you were talking, so here's the thing I thought of. So for those who are watching this right now, what I would love for you to do, and I bring this up because we were talking internally the other day, and we were basically saying, man, like if we could find out one thing to like from our customers, like what would we want to know from them? And the thing that I thought of is like, man, who in your various specialties, because there's, I mean, the ones that Chris just talked about are like eye care related, but I know that there's probably people on the call who are allergy and asthma. There's some who are behavioral health. There's some who are urology or gastro. What I would love for you to think about right now, and if you can, put it in the chat if you want to, what are your either appointment types or your patients that are most valuable to the practice? And I mean this in two ways. Maybe one, it is just like revenue that those kinds of appointments bring to the practice. That may be one of them. Or maybe it's like the patients that really need like specific care. Like if they don't get that care, it could mean like really bad things. And so I'm going to take like 15 seconds and I'm just going to be quiet as you think through that of who are those patients or what are those appointment types that are most valuable for my practice. So I'm just going to give 15 seconds for you to think about that.
And then ortho is another big one as well, actually, as I think about it.
Yep. All right, cool. So we gave 15 seconds of silence. Maybe it was awkward for you, but I think that's that's what's important for us to think about is, hey, who are these patients that we actually are really important to our practice, or those appointment types? And then we can dive in from there. So with that, let's move on to our next slide. As you have that in mind. So maybe you thought of a patient or an appointment type, maybe you didn't, but now that we have thought through our initial piece, right? What was our first piece? We want to maximize our patient database. We defined maybe who our target audiences might be. Now it's dividing those target audiences into the ways that we want to reach out to them. And the two biggest categories that I think of is automated versus manual campaigns. And so the idea with this, if we move to the next slide, is thinking to like, is this a one-time event kind of thing? If it's like the trunk show example, or you're having an open house, or there's like a big event of some sort going on, that probably is going to fall into more of a one-time event, right? Like you're not going to be having ongoing automation, reaching out to those patients because there's something like on the calendar specifically that you want to get people to. Whereas maybe there's something on the other side where, hey, this is really recurring. Like we have patients that haven't been in for over a year and we want to get them back in, but we don't just want that to happen one time. We don't just want all of our patients who haven't been in for over a year. If there's new patients that haven't been in for over a year next month, we want to get them in as well. So that's going to be more of those are more of your automated. So those are your two different campaigns. You've got your manual ones and you've got your automated campaigns. So again, Chris, like just thinking through examples of how our previous customers and the case studies that we've worked with, what are some of the examples of how we've done that, like between the automation versus manual campaigns? And then, yeah, I know like definitely getting into how we've done that on the vital interaction side, I think may be helpful for people.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we've I've touched on this previously, but in terms of automated campaigns, I think many patients have, or all patients have a care schedule or a care plan, for example.
Mm-hmm.
I can think of an example for diabetes, for example, where you're diagnosed with diabetes, then you have to have your A1C checked every 3 months. You probably have to have a retinopathy exam every year, for example.
Mm-hmm.
And then, you take the other case of patients with cataracts or even therapy management within behavioral health, where there's a medication management plan, and you want to make sure that these patients get seen every maybe 3 months, 6 months. And I think where the automation benefits from is knowing the last patient's appointment, did they show up or not? And do they have their next scheduled appointment in 3 months' time, or 6 months' time, or a year's time? So then that coincides with a recall. So lots of our practices, you enter recalls when a patient leaves the office. The practice scheduler might enter a recall to come back in 1 year. But what if the patient has a telehealth visit and that patient doesn't have a recall entered? And I think that's where our sort of safety net, so to speak, campaigns using the smart list engine, which we'll touch on, can help stop patient slippage, I suppose would be the right word to say, is, let's make sure we get patients back into the office in a timely manner. Because again, there's one thing to have an appointment, show up to the appointment, but what about the next appointment? Is that appointment scheduled, or do you enter a recall? And that's where we can sort of talk about the smart list engine coming up here in a sec, in just making sure that we know when patients are due back, and if they haven't had an appointment, and come back soon.
Yep. Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think those are the big keys, right? Like,
yeah,
who are the patients and do they need to come back in? And what I think about even with this is, even if it's not getting patients back in, like, because like, for example, you mentioned earlier, like orthopedics or something. In orthopedics, you may not have patients who it's like, oh, they need to come back every year because they're going to have a broken leg every year. I mean, that's hopefully not the case, right? But it's thinking through, for maximizing our patient database, maybe it's just making sure that those patients that we do have a good experience, and then let the rest of the world know. So having campaigns that are built in to make sure that they're satisfied after their visit, that they got the care that they needed, having them go review on review sites. I mean, all of that is important aspects, and all of that is like a form of marketing, I would say, to make sure that you're maximizing the patient database that you have while you have them.
Exactly. Yeah. And then the tools in which to do so, which is important.
Yeah, I'll let you dive into some of the tools. I know you have some slides here on like the smart list engine and such.
Yeah, so this sort of goes into the nuts and bolts of what I suppose this is our bread and butter of our tool in a lot of ways, which we call the smart list engine. We can get into that in a sec. But if you think of on the left-hand side here, an average practice management system has billing and insurance things that they have to take care of, customizable records, patient notes, patient charts, and of course, patient staff and scheduling. And obviously, most practices have appointment reminders. So if a patient schedules an appointment, obviously I don't think there's any customers of ours that don't do appointment reminders. And I think that's a given in this day and age.
Yeah.
And then what we like to consider our smart list engine is, and I tried to go over the way this works, is if we think of the slide on the left here with patient billing and insurance, or patient scheduling. So let's look at this slide in the middle here. This basically says all appointments, all active patient appointments that occurred 1 year to a year and a half ago for an annual exam. And that might be an annual eye exam. It could be anything. Again, like Joey mentioned earlier, if you can think of any examples, this could also be CPT, diagnosis code, any kind of thing. So now I have my list of patients that occurred 1 year to a year and a half ago. And that's great. But now what we want to do is subtract any of those patients in the first list from the second list, essentially saying these patients that had an annual eye exam a year ago do not have a future appointment. And that, I think, is a pretty big deal. And amazingly, there's a lot of patients on the average list that we build. If I'm right in thinking that, Joey, it's usually a very large list of patients that need an annual eye exam, for example, but have not been back since. And it's just a very sort of plug and play, no-brainer type of feature to add in terms of tracking patients for different care plans.
Yeah, well, and I think, like, I mean, again, like giving the example of like annual eye exam, I mean, there's a fair amount of patients that are going to schedule their yearly exam by themselves,
Yeah.
right? And so that's the importance of having tools like this, like whether you're using a tool like the Smart List Engine Vital Interaction or something separately using a separate spreadsheet. It's one thing to be able to pull a list of patients that were seen at some point in the past or has some sort of procedure some point in the past. But probably just as important as pulling that is subtracting the patients that are already seen or don't need to be seen, or like, co-managed if they came in as a referral from another practice. I mean, that stuff is super important because, I mean, the whole title of this presentation is maximizing your patient database, right? I mean, I'll tell you something that's not maximizing your patient database is reaching out to patients that you don't need to be reaching out to and them getting upset that you're reaching out to them, right? So you have to be thoughtful about, hey, who are the patients that I do need to reach out to? And then how am I doing that and making sure that it's only those patients that I'm reaching out to? Because I think that's when you really maximize that care for those patients, because you're actually caring for them when they need it, rather than, sending a bunch of messages. They get fatigued from getting all the messages, and then they never end up scheduling or coming back to you or leaving you good reviews.
Exactly. Yeah. And again, this is a broad example, but you can think of, especially as our integration is improving over time, being able to drill down into very specific use cases, again, for CPT and ICD code, and just making sure those patients are being seen, especially for MIPS and macro. And then, so you imagine this list tool running, adding and subtracting various subsets of patients that can run on a daily basis. It can run on an hourly basis. So that changes day by day. So it's not just a one-time list. It can be a one-time list if you want to have all active patients in your system, or maybe all active patients that got seen at a specific location 1 year ago between the ages of 15 and 25. I'm just making this up, but you can imagine the types of criteria that you can triangulate that data from. But in this case, these are patients that need an annual eye exam every year and have not been back since. And then it could be, the output could be a text, email, or voice. And then here we have an example that we can send to the patient just to let them know that, hey, we haven't seen you in a while, you're due for an exam, please call us to schedule, or even patient chat using the patient chat database as well. But I think the cool thing is just being able to target certain patients on a timely manner that runs in the background.
And I think it's that one. I think it's that 1, 2, 3 approach, right? You've got your practice management system. You're probably super familiar with your practice management system, or hopefully as much as you can be. And then from there, it's not like having to add a whole bunch of steps to a process from there. It's, hey, just let's take that data that you already have in your practice management system, that you already understand, that you already know the patients that are there, and then let's just run some automation from it and automatically be reaching out to patients, as needed. And that, like, it just makes life so much easier for everyone, because one, you're not having to do a bunch of manual outreach for patients that still need care, and two, patients are getting communication without having to like pick up a phone and answer it, because so few patients now actually answer the phone. It's a lot of wasted time, unfortunately, that practices have to use to actually like call out to a patient, and then they don't answer, then they leave a voicemail. And so it's automating that approach all the way from the practice management system through integration with another system, and then automating the messaging with it.
Yeah, it's almost like I consider us a middleware between the PM system and the patient, and just helping the functionality of the practice as well, because there's only so many phone calls you can make in a single day. There's only so much tracking you can do in a single day, and just it's just important patients get seen for their care, essentially.
Agreed.
Yeah, and then here are some examples. So now we're talking about the bulk sending. I think lots of customers use this. This is one of my favorite tools, and I think it has huge potential as we improve on certain features of it. But again, we got approached by a customer to say, we have a trunk show coming up, and these trunk shows often include certain deals on eyewear. For example, you can see here 75% off the first pair, 30% off the second pair. And just going into the box sending tool and sending all patients at a certain location, because this was at a certain location, to say, hey, we have a trunk show happening Thursday, April 5th, 1 to 5, come along. So it's a very good way to engage patients and re-engage patients back to the practice that might not have even thought about this. And then, of course, they get a good deal on their glasses as well.
Yeah, and I think you have another one on the next slide as well with like a template. And I think the thing to think about with this is oftentimes practices like you all are already doing this kind of stuff. You're already doing some sort of work to try and engage patients. And so it's adding on to that work and sending out messaging to those patients. And so we talked about some of the automation of sending out to those patients, but maybe it's just an event that you're putting on as a practice. And it's, hey, how can I like maximize the like for my community being able to see that event that's happening and coming to that event without me having to do a bunch of work around it. And so I think that's where the advantage of tools like the bulk sending tool or other marketing tools that you may have in order to just get a message out to them, whether that's an email, whether that's a text, a one-time, just letting them know that it's happening. Again, it's informational for them. It's not forcing them to do anything, but it's just giving them information that they need that may help them in the long run.
Yeah, and it can even be on a different side, like maybe the office has to close for a few days because of bad weather as well.
Yep.
Just any form of communications to all your patients quickly and easily is very important.
Yep, absolutely. And I think so, yeah, we can move on to this next slide. I think that brings us really well to this of what is the verbiage that you're using in that messaging. So just to do a brief recap. So we first talked about, all right, we basically want to understand who we want to reach out to. So we talked about defining your target audience. Those are your groups of people. Then we said, okay, what kind of campaigns are we running to each of those? So we said, okay, we may have some automated campaigns. We may have some manual campaigns that we're running out or sending out based off of that. So now it's thinking through, okay, that's great. But now what do I actually want to put in the messaging that's going out to those patients? We showed you a couple of previews of, what a text might look like, what an email might look like. So just to start with this, I wanted to give us some high level stats here on this next slide of like email, text, and voice call, some of the stats around it. So with our first one here, so SMS open rates, we did some studies around, what are open rates between all methods of communication. And as I mentioned earlier, a lot of patients aren't answering the phone anymore. However, 98% of people who receive a text look at that text. And I mean, it's just astonishing to me, right? Like that is a very high number. That of course does not mean that people are doing stuff from that text. Like we'll have some of our case studies. We'll talk more about like actually action taken from it. But the fact that there's such a high open rate of text messages tells me like that is an avenue that we definitely want to be like using as much as possible. The next one, so under emails, so Experian has done some studies around this, and personalization in the emails themselves like increases the open rates by 26%. And this should be common knowledge, right? When you get an email that's completely standard, and I'll have an example of this in just a second. It's like, okay, I'm not going to click on that. I'm not probably even going to open it. It's going to go right into my trash folder. But just by personalizing that, when you see in that subject line, oh, it has my name in it, or oh, it has something directly that references me. Now all of a sudden, that's gonna increase my willingness to open that email. And the final one, this is one that we did from an internal study ourselves. So patients are 3 times more likely to listen to a message if the recording is from the doctor. So what we did is we had like some of these messages that were going out via phone call to patients. And it was just a canned voice where it's, a voice talent or somebody from the office. And it's just saying, hey, it's time to schedule an appointment, call our office at this number. And that's great. But what we then did is we said, hey, let's actually use the provider's voice, have them record just a canned message that we can send out to any patient. And then all of a sudden, like we didn't know what was going to happen, right? But then those patients were 3 times more likely to actually listen to that message. They pick up the phone. Oh my goodness, it's my provider who's actually like left a message for me, and they listen to that message, and then they actually take action from that. So I just wanted to point out these 3 things. So looking at personalization in messages, text messages, emails, phone calls, all of these are still very valid methods of communication to getting messages to patients. And so I think it's important to highlight what are the advantages of each of them. On text messages, it's that everybody's looking at them. On emails, hey, it's personalization really means a lot to people. In phone calls, it's, hey, when it's actually my provider, when it's actually like something that's directly like I have knowledge of, I'm going to be more likely to listen to that message, take action from that message. So I want to give a personal example here now of how this has affected me in my role. So I got this email the other week, and it was from I blacked out obviously some of the information here so that you can't see who they are. But I got this email. It was super generic, right? It's like, hey, customer, we help software companies get more members, and just I mean, my role, I'm an account manager. I work with lots of healthcare practices, and I seek to help them as much as I can. So I get this email, and I mean, I ended up opening it, but I just instantly went into my trash folder because it's got no personalization. I don't even know what it's really talking about. It's like, we help software companies get more members. I don't know what members are. Then it's talking about opportunities. So I didn't even understand what was happening. It goes to the trash. So now think through that of how you're messaging your patients. Here's an example of how you might be messaging. And to be clear, if you have like messages like this that are going out to patients, that's still great. Better to automate this than to have to manually be reaching out. But it's saying, okay, you're due for an appointment at Eye Care Associates, call to schedule an appointment. That's great, but it may kind of feel like they're just, a number in the system, right? Hey, we ended up hitting the line for scheduling an appointment. There was an automated text that goes out. You can tell it's automated. So compare this to the final example here of, oh, this is the one that we had on the other slide. Hey, this is Dr. Smith from Eye Care Associates. I noticed you haven't been in for over a while. All of a sudden, this is way more personal, and patients take much more action on it because it feels like it was actually addressed to them, and it wasn't just like an automation piece to the system. So with this, I think what I think about is taking a step back and thinking through what's happened in the history of healthcare. At one point, probably at one point before there were even phones, you had to go to the doctor when you had to go to the doctor, right? Or maybe there was like a little note that somebody left and said, hey, come back at some point. Then eventually there were phones. And so then you had a front office staff who was calling out to those patients when it was time for scheduling appointments or to remind them about their appointment. And then it was, it evolved a little further to the point where you're automating some of the outreach to the patients, but not all of it. But now I think we're circling back to a point where people desire like more personal communication in what's happening. And so when we're able to use the technology that we now have, that's great, but we want to be able to still personalize that. And so if we look here, we can see, hey, this is automation still. It's using the same kind of data that other message was, you're due for an appointment at Eye Care Associates, but it's personalizing that message to the patient and helping them to feel like, wow, somebody's actually reaching out to me because they know that I need eye care, or I need, whatever else care that they may need. So I just wanted to give this as a personal example to help think through, like, what are the areas that we can personalize in the messages that we're sending out to make sure that patients actually feel cared for, even though it may be part of an automated system. So anyway, so Chris, I'll hand it over to you to talk through some actual personalization use cases of how we've used this.
Yeah, so patient education, I think that's become a huge hot topic lately, and we can get into that in the next case study. But one key example I can think of that we're using across quite a few different customers now is, again, a patient might have an appointment tomorrow or in 3 days, and it might be for maybe surgery. It could be a cataract evaluation. It could be for an evaluation and management appointment. But again, if you think about a message that goes out, you have an appointment tomorrow with Dr. Wickham at 2 p.m. Looking forward to seeing you. But what about if you could add some sort of educational video tied to that message, such as even a video from a doctor, or just some stock video that lots of companies use for eye care, for cataract evaluations, for example. Even now we're looking at seeing some doctors use TikTok before their appointment, believe it or not. I think that's a brilliant idea as I think about it. But anything to educate the patient on what to expect before the visit in any shape or form, I think has been really, really important. And again, we'll go over some of the case studies here as we go along. But patient education is key. And then if you think about patient education, even filling out patient paperwork as well. But I think what one thing about patient education before and after a visit does, it sort of helps settle the nerves for certain appointment types in what I'm seeing, Joey, if you've seen some of those examples as well. It's just a nice video to watch on what to expect before the visit. Maybe you need to fast before the visit, just something to prepare the patient on what to expect for a certain type of visit.
Yeah, well, I think that we, if we're at a practice, we understand all the ins and outs of what's going to go on for every procedure or what kind of visit. And I think of this for myself with vital interaction. I know all about vital interaction, all the intricacies. But then, our customer or something who's using the platform, it's like they may not use every tool of it every day, so they don't have the same kind of knowledge. And so same thing with practices and patients. Patients don't have that knowledge. And so they don't know what to expect when they come in for an appointment, even though that may be the 10th appointment that you've done that day. And so having to put ourselves back in the shoes of patients, hey, what would we like to know before we come in for an appointment? So just so we know what to expect, so we don't have to ask maybe as many questions in the office.
Yeah. And then even after an appointment too, after surgery, I remember my anesthesiologist calling me after I broke my shoulder and just checking if I was still in pain, things like that. Maybe that's something that could be automated through some sort of questionnaire or video from the doctor themselves to say, hey, just how's everything going 5 days post-surgery, for example. I'm just thinking aloud here, but these are some of the examples that we've seen at VI to help our customers as well. And then this one, I call it a no-brainer, but rescheduling patients that no-show or cancelled as well. And that is something, of course, that we track at VI, knowing if a patient missed an appointment yesterday or 2 days ago, did they schedule a future appointment? That's something that we can do through automation, or even just provide a list of patients that no-show. But I do know it's a serious burden on practices to track patients that no-showed or canceled their appointment and reschedule, because it's a big deal if a patient no-shows an appointment that's a missed slot that could have been filled out by another patient. The doctor might be upset because now a patient hasn't showed up, or just tracking missed and no-shows, cancellations, and sending out a gentle reminder to reschedule that appointment, and then tracking if they did reschedule that appointment. Because at the end of the day, it does boost the bottom line of appointment volume and making sure that patients come back to the office. And then again, this one is just becoming more and more important, especially as we improve the integration and have this capability across many different practice management systems. But CBT and ICD codes, these are really more very specific targeted campaigns. And sadly, with very important diagnosis, it's important patients get seen if they have a certain diagnosis. So again, I've mentioned it loads of times now, but patients who had cataract diagnosis that do not have surgery, let's make sure that they at least get seen by the doctor or know the patient options, even with a video that a patient was diagnosed with a certain condition. Let's send them a video on the importance of getting a follow-up appointment. Again, you can think about other things like diabetes management, therapy, medication management. I suppose we serve all kinds of customers, Joey, but CBT and ICD code tracking is very important, especially from a billing perspective. If a patient was billed for a certain code, you're typically eligible to bill for that code again, say in another year for an eye exam, and very many use cases like that.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think and ranges specialties, right? I mean, we probably don't even know all of them. Like we work with like dozens of specialties around this kind of stuff. But there's always new things that are happening as well within specialties of like follow-ups and approaches to take with certain kinds of patients. You mentioned MIPS and MACRA, making sure that those follow-ups are in place. So I mean, we're constantly still learning stuff as well with the practices that we work with about what kinds of patients need to be seen when.
Yeah, definitely. And then even patients with a certain billing code or ICD code that might be eligible for a new type of treatment as well. That's coming up a lot as technology changes and different treatment options occur. Patients that had a previous treatment for a condition, now there might be some new treatment available that patients with that CPT code could now be eligible for as well, which is coming up a lot as healthcare changes and the landscape changes, and reimbursement opportunities for providers and practices is constantly being improved, especially through Medicare and Medicaid.
Yep. Cool. All right. So this part actually gets me pretty excited. So we've talked through defining your target audience, right? We segregated that. Then we figured out what are those automated campaigns, what are those manual campaigns. Then from there, like what we were just talking about, we were figuring out, okay, with those, whether they're manual campaigns, whether they're automated campaigns, how are we messaging the campaigns? What's the verbiage that we're using? How are we making that more personal for the patient? And all of that is great, but until we actually get to this piece of tracking and measuring the results, you're just throwing stuff into the wind, throwing stuff to the wall. Hopefully something sticks. Who knows if it is or not. And this reminds me of the history of once again, it's like we're sending mailers out to patients. Hopefully some of them schedule, but you have no line of sight, right? So this is the advantage with technology. We're doing all this stuff, but now we're actually able to track and measure the success of it, so that we can figure out what we need to do in the future to keep that going. Something that I think of with this, and is just an analogy to like the eye care world. If you've ever had an eye appointment, I'm sure you've had the piece, or maybe this is my eye doctor, but when they're checking out like your eyes, they'll do like hey, better number 1 or better number 2. And then you're like, oh, number 1. And then it's better number 2 or number 3. And you go through that, right? And that's exactly how I think of like marketing approach happens, because you're not always going to get things right exactly the first time, but you do something and then you figure out what pieces of it work and what don't, and then you iterate on it, you do the next step of it. So without further ado, I think going into these areas of what are you measuring, what are you tracking within the results. So I mean, a really simple one, something as simple for me as account manager, measuring clicks, right? If you're sending out emails, how many patients are actually clicking on the link that you're sending out? That's helpful information to know about, like, are people actually interested in what we're sending out? Or if we're doing all this patient education and the click rate is like 1%, maybe it's not as valuable as we think it is. And Chris, I'll let you go into more of this, because this is more your wheelhouse of tracking and measuring the data there.
Yeah, in terms of link clicks and patient education, it's just a big deal. I think we always wanted to find a way to not only deliver a message and see if it was sent, but if we embed a link, how many patients are clicking on that link to view the actual video as well.
Yeah.
Which is, yeah. And that's been a very interesting topic, which we'll go into in the other case studies as well.
Yeah. And I think and then like going into these other ones that we have right here, comparing those outreach efforts of like, hey, if we did this campaign in June, what was the appointment volume in July or the end of June? Did the appointment volume increase when we were able to do these campaigns? Or maybe you're tracking something else. Maybe it's around the show rate that you have during that month. So it's comparing like the campaigns or the activities that you're doing to the results. And it's important to understand what you want to measure before you actually do it, so that you can look at before and after. And then I think it's figuring out, and so I mentioned this at the beginning, but we've even noticed that there's certain things that work in some part of the United States and some parts that it doesn't, where it's like something in the deep South might work for patients in terms of personalization, where maybe in the Northeast, people just want the information. They don't need all of the other stuff in the messages. And so it's not a one size fits all. but it's learning from what you do and deciding, hey, this demographic of patients maybe are, the older patient base that a lot of practices end up having respond better to, a phone call message from their provider rather than an email or a text. But sometimes it's the exact opposite. You may think that, oh, we have an old patient base and they're not gonna actually look at text, but the results are exactly the opposite. They actually respond way better to text. So figuring out what works between those patients, between who your patients are versus the practice down the street, all that stuff is going to be stuff that you figure out when you put all this together and you really track and measure those results.
Yeah, even home phones. Actually, I'm back at home visiting my parents at the moment, and they still have a home phone, and
Yep.
lots of people do. It's
Yeah.
actually quite cool and old school.
Yep.
I wish I had one myself. But yeah, I think just identifying patient preferences, whether it's email, is it text, is it phone, and then even if we try the home phone and it fails or it's an invalid number, having that backup method to the text or email as well, just to guarantee that at least a message goes out.
Yep. All right, let's get into the case studies. So this one, Chris mentioned this earlier. It's like the no-brainer type stuff. I think of it low-hanging fruit. So this is the first case study that we did. So we worked with a group, and what we wanted to see was just annual reactivation success. So this is, again, very low-hanging fruit, super simple and easy to do. Basically, we're just looking at patients who had not been seen for over a year, and we reached out to them with a personalized message, asking them about their health, seeing if they needed a future appointment. And the results were, we sent the message to 3,766 patients. So that's how many patients initially got the message. Then out of that, 321 patients booked. And so just taking a snapshot of that right there, like that is a huge win to me, because really any patients, even if that number had been 10 appointments ended up getting booked, that's still a huge win, right? Because that's 10 patients that may not have scheduled without some sort of an outreach. And so it's the very low hanging fruit of like, you're not hurting anything by, I mean, if a patient hasn't been in for over a year, you're not hurting anything by messaging them and seeing if they need to come back in for anything, or just checking up on their health, making sure that they're still aware that you're there if they need anything. But 321 appointments booked, I mean, that tells me there's a huge market of patients that, hey, they want to be reached out to and checked on for their care. So, I mean, that's like what, like 8-9% of the patients that were message scheduled. But probably the even more compelling stat about this is looking at the overall volume for this practice. After we like delivered this campaign, we looked at the 3 months and the 6 months before what their total appointment volume was. And then we looked at it after the campaign, and their appointment volume increased by 20%. So that means just by sending out an annual campaign, sending some follow-ups to that, their appointment volume increased like drastically to the point where they were able to like fill a lot more slots that were on their schedule. So this is like a really exciting case study to me because of how small of a lift it is on practices, even on the vital interaction side, to be able to do.
Yeah, it's interesting as well. I'm working with a few customers now in hot climates like Arizona, for example. Far too hot for a British guy like me. But in any case, during June and July and August, lots of patients move away. They call it the snowbird season, that maybe we're due for appointments or recalls to come back and being seen. So now we're doing, for a lot of customers and any customers on this call, if you see your appointment dropping during June, July, and August, patients that had recalls probably had less success because patients might have been out of town and now they're coming back while it's cooler. Is let's look at all patients that received a recall during those months or were due for an appointment, and just do a sort of a clean sweep and just let patients know, hey, you were due for an appointment during this time, come back and see us. And we're producing thousands of results on that just to try and recalibrate the appointment volume and making sure that lots of practices recover for that snowbird season. And again, we had the same dialogue during COVID as well. We did similar campaigns, Joey, during COVID when practices were closed. Let's try and get that safety net going for our customers and make sure that we can recapture patients that should have been seen but haven't.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. All right, cover our last case study here, Chris, and then we'll close it out.
Yeah, so this this is one that I've harped on about a bit during this webinar, but what we've been doing a lot with our customers is experimenting with embedding videos in our messages. So this particular case study were patients due for a cataract evaluation, and we had a doctor embed a video within the message. So typically you'll notice our normal templates are very educational, or having confirm or decline options. You have an appointment tomorrow, for example, but now we're adding educational content before the visit. And then what we've seen is by up to 40 to 80% of patients are clicking on the link before the appointment, or rather patients who received the link and then clicked on the link is a very extremely high ratio.
Yeah.
And then we can see the no-show percentage here, which is pretty low for an eye care practice. But then what we've seen, so we compared the before and after no-show rate by adding this video link. So pre-go live with just a standard message that obviously we always do appointment reminders about their upcoming appointment. The no-show rate before going live with the embedded video, and we also do it in text message, and then post go live for this appointment type, obviously a lot lower. So the no-show rate improvement for this particular appointment type was 49, almost 50% reduction in no-show rate just by adding an educational content to the video.
Yeah.
And now we're expanding this across a lot more customers. We're looking at doing this for reactivation campaigns as well. So patients who don't have an appointment, we're looking at providers recording videos themselves, maybe even TikToks, as we've mentioned before. But I think all this to say, if you can personalize your message in any way, shape, or form, it's really going to add to the likelihood of that patient showing up or scheduling an appointment as well.
Yeah. And these ones, what I really like about these is you may, if you're on this call, maybe it's like orthopedics, right? And it's like, again, we don't have patients coming in every year for an appointment, but maybe it's, you want to educate those patients before they come in. There's, maybe I'm trying to think of like procedures like total joint replacement or something within orthopedics. And hey, that can maybe be kind of a scary thing before they're coming in for those procedures. So you may have like manual outreach that you were already doing around those patients, like getting them information before that appointment, but also being able to send education videos before, whether that's a pre-canned message by the doctor, or you're using some other like video database, or just pointing to a video on YouTube of like, hey, here's what to expect before your appointment. That can ease the burden so much for those patients of like, oh, I actually know what to expect. I don't have to ask 1,000 questions when I come in. I just feel much better going into the appointment. So I think this transfers into all kinds of specialties. Every specialty needs to educate their patients. Whether you're ortho, whether you're allergy, whether you're eye doctor, whether you're behavioral health. I mean, all of those specialties, the thing in common is you have to educate your patients still.
Yeah, and even a few practices that I've worked with, patients are commenting on the video when they actually see the doctor as well, just to say how helpful it is. So
yeah, it's cool stuff. All right, our final recap here. So thinking through this, so something we didn't like specifically hit on, but it's planning ahead, right? With your practice, what things to expect in what seasons. Hey, when it's the back to school season in the fall or end of summer, what can you expect to happen at your practice? Do you have patients who need to be seen for certain things before school happens, or getting physicals, that kind of thing? When it's the end of school season, do you have something else happening, or allergies that are happening at certain seasons? That better than anybody. So planning ahead, creating the target audiences based off of that, narrowing it down, deciding what kind of campaigns you're sending, and then figuring out the verbiage, the personalization that you're going to put in that verbiage. And then from there, the final piece of that, of course, right, is actually measuring the results. What is working, what is not working. So I'm sure this can feel a little bit overwhelming. Wow, it's a lot that we just talked about. We filled an entire hour talking about it, but it really just boils down to these small pieces: planning ahead, creating your target audience, building the content, and analyzing those campaigns from there. So if you can do those things, you are going to be well on your way to success. And as the title of the webinar suggests, maximizing the patient database that you already have. So that concludes the webinar. Would love to open it up to Q&A. We already have some of the questions that have come in, so we'll answer some of those. And if you have other questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. If you have to go right away, like right now, you can email this webinars@vitalinteraction.com as well. So one of the things that was put here as well. So talking about like the spam rates. This is a huge thing that we've actually noticed as a company is there's this like there's so much crackdown on like robocalls and even in text messages marking things as spam. And so this is something important that our company has gone through with text and is now working through with the phone call portion. Is there's now like registries for third-party organizations to go through to make sure that whether it's text messaging or phone calls that they're doing are all registered to make sure that like, hey, we're not going to be flagged as spam and it actually goes through to the carrier. So that has become more and more important. And that's what, again, we've done it on text and we're working on it on the phone call piece. So whether you're using something like Vital Interaction or another system, I think that's one of the most important things to check with them is like, hey, what is your registration process to make sure that our messages are not going to be flagged as spam and then just go into some spam folder or not actually be delivered to the patient. So yeah, I don't know if you have anything else to add on that, Chris, but I know that that's come up a lot recently.
Yeah, it's something we're very aware of and constantly working on. It's a big topic at the moment.
Yep.
There was
oh, go ahead.
I was just looking at if the webinar will be sent to all participants, and I answered that one.
Oh, yep, perfect. Yep, we'll send a recording. Anyone who attended here, we'll send that recording out so that you have a copy of that. Let me look at the other Q&A. All right, so somebody asking, is this service primarily for marketing and reactivation, or is it for general communication as well? Good question. I think maybe a little bit of a trick answer. The more and more I get into this kind of world, I realize that everything is a form of marketing. So to answer the question directly, we do all sorts of communication. So we do appointment reminders, as Chris mentioned. That's kind of a dime a dozen. Everyone does appointment reminders. It's what you add on to that that's important, though. So appointment reminders, great, getting them there for their appointment, but it's reactivating patients after they've been in, sending messages to point them to, fill out surveys or reviews afterwards, or check up on them, make sure that they're doing okay. It's, potentially texting back and forth with patients. So we do all manner of that. And in my mind, I think of all of that as an aspect of marketing. Marketing can maybe kind of feel like a slimy word to you, like, oh, marketing to our patients, but that's the truth. We're trying to get them information that they need. Any other questions?
Trying to access them all here. Not sure if you have visibility of them.
Yep, and we'll do another minute here or so if there's other questions that come in. I know we're at time, but one more minute.
Do feel free to email us with any other questions.
Yeah, for sure. Feel free to email the webinars@vitalinteraction.com. Yeah, we hope this has been valuable for you as a practice. We're happy to help explore more options. Whether you're using Vital Interaction or not, we can explore how we can help or give you the knowledge that we've learned. I mean, we've worked with dozens of specialties, hundreds of practices. We've learned a lot, and we're happy to pass on that information because really the why behind what we do is we want to help the patients, get them the healthcare that they need, and if we can do that by helping serve you, then we would love to do that. So feel free to reach out to us, and we will talk next time.
Thank you.